couple of years ago, an old friend and good friend and colleague came to me with a story about her friend Mike. He had got first-class honours as a mature student when he returned to college, and a job came up in Dublin to where he travelled at his own expense, only to find or to discover when he arrived for the interview that the rates of pay were going to be far less than he anticipated. So we got to work on this, and I'd like to thank Lee in my own office and the staff in the Ceann Comhairle's Bills office for their assistance in moving this bill forward. And thank you, Minister. I'm presuming that it goes on to committee stage, and I understand that it would receive a favourable response today from the Minister. I await the OPALA analysis with great interest, as I feel that the bill is a simple solution to a real-world problem. This bill will amend the Employment Equality Act of 1998 to provide for pay transparency in the advertising of jobs. In the 1998 Act, Section 10, subsection 1, prohibits the advertisement of any job where it indicates an intention to discriminate or might reasonably be understood as indicating such an intention. This bill will add another ground for prohibition of a job ad, namely the omission of pay scales. The basis of most discrimination is economic in nature, and it must be combated with economic solutions which empower people to combat inequality. Minorities, people, do not need mere moral support, although that does help, but they need real solutions, and I hope that this bill is a small contribution towards making that happen. I'm grateful for the engagements which I and my office had with the trade union sector. The Financial Services Union in particular were very proactive in reaching out and sharing details of their research. According to their research, in 2018, there was a gap of €26,000 between males and females within the financial services, insurance and real estate industries. I'm grateful to them for offering their support and their roadmap for action within the Gender Pay Gap Report, and their Gender Pay Gap Report should be examined by government. Point 1 of this roadmap was to make pay rates transparent, so I'm glad the bill would seek to implement this. In addition to discrimination on the grounds of gender, there are many other reasons why this measure is important. An ERSI report in January of this year stated that migrant workers are paid as much as 40% less than their Irish counterparts. The problem affects lower paid and manual professions most, and for every €1 an Irish worker earned, a non-Irish worker earned 78 cents. Especially disadvantaged were nationals from Eastern Europe, Africa and the rest of the world. Some groups fare better than Irish nationals. For example, nationals from EU West, North America, Australia and Oceania, Asia and the UK are more likely to be in professional or managerial occupations. Even if all of these factors are still controlled for, migrant workers earn less than their Irish equivalents. The current labour market is extremely stagnant, with many employers refusing to raise wages even as workers enjoy increased options. A rebalancing is needed even as the employers resist. This is especially the case with young people who understand and demand pay transparency far more than older counterparts. They understand they are at risk of being left behind without it, and businesses should recognise the competitive advantage it gives them. I see that government senators may also be moving a bill in relation to this issue, and I had briefed Minister O'Gorman about this bill late last year, and I await his response today. He was minded to await the EU proposals on the matter, so the issue does now seem to be far more about the timeline and means of implementation. I will yield the rest of my time to Deputy Rose Conway-Walsh, who co-sponsors the bill, but I just want to acknowledge, in dealing with workers over the last number of years, workers' rights are a serious issue, and only today I spoke to one of the Tralee Debenhams workers. The Debenhams workers had recently received, along with their colleagues across the country, a Human Rights Award from the ICCL for their work in standing up for workers' rights. And I'd like to commend them for their bravery in ensuring that stock wasn't removed from Debenhams stores without them receiving their what's rightfully theirs for many years of service. The Cleary's workers, I think, are waiting 8 years, and Debenhams 3 years nearly now. Retail is a sector which is particularly prone to pay issue with zero-hour contracts, precarious employment and other measures used to squeeze workers. Thank you.
Garmahagat, and at the outset I want to acknowledge the work of my colleague Pa Daly and Lee Daly in his office as well of the work on this bill, because the more transparency around wages is the better for all workers, as it can help to ensure a fair deal, obviously, from employers. Pay transparency is also an important tool for tackling the gender pay gap and other forms of pay-related discrimination. Progress has been made in the area of pay transparency, but there still more needs to be done, and some of those reasons and the measurements that have been done were outlined by Pa in his contribution. This bill seeks to ensure pay transparency for roles advertised for businesses and indeed for public sector organisations. It relies on the provisions of the Employment Equality Act 1998-2015 and specifically Section 10, which places an obligation on persons not to publish or display an advert which does not include the pay associated with the job. The bill amends Section 10 of the Employment Equality Act 1998 as amended to include an obligation to publish the approximate remuneration owed to the worker for taking up a contract of employment. What all this means is that no job adverts online or anywhere else cannot be included, have to include details on pay. It's very straightforward and it's a practical step to make pay more transparent. This legislation is an important step in strengthening the position of workers, specifically in the job application process. Anyone who has searched for a job, especially online, will be familiar with scrolling down and finding where one expects to see a salary instead of an actual figure, phrases such as depending on experience or competitive salary. It's very disheartening. The process of applying for jobs can be a grueling task with many steps to the application process. All workers should be able to see in advance what pay or pay range based on experience is being offered. This allows people to make an informed decision on whether or not to apply. Workers already employed by the company or in the same sector should be able to see the pay being advertised to new recruits. All workers stand to benefit from the common sense change to employment law, but as was said, this change will particularly help women and minorities to ensure that they are being offered the same remuneration at the end of the application process as any other candidate. This bill will also level the playing field for companies that already provide the level of this level of transparency on pay. And it should be noted that most good employers do include details on pay. The legislation is making sure that all employers are obliged to follow suit. The truth is that the lack of transparency and asymmetrical information reduces the bargaining power of the applicant and skews the power in favour of the employer. Knowing the salary up front lets a candidate understand whether a job would be financially viable for him or her before committing the time and effort to apply. It shows workers already in the job what salaries are being offered to attract new employees, leaving the employer to negotiate with the successful candidate on salary after the fact can lead to women, particularly people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and minorities, often ending up on lower salaries. And there's absolute evidence to back that up. An increasing body of research shows that salary transparency is the way of creating more equitable workplaces. In the third level sector in particular, we know that the working conditions for tutors and for lecturers and researchers have been eroded by the employment practices of underfunded colleges. We also know that it disproportionately affects women, as was said. And we have a particular problem in this country in terms of the labour force and labour force planning, because all of the research tells us that particularly women with school-age children, and especially lone mothers, are exiting the workplace because of the discrepancies between and the unfairness within employment and in employment conditions. So decisions around women working full-time or part-time or not working outside the home at all are impacted by all this. So I think this will be a knock-on effect of this legislation, that we will in some way, but there's an awful lot to be done, but we will in some way try to address that as well for mothers of school-age children. So the bill will contribute to the transparency and fairness of that, and it will also obviously impact on social welfare top-ups. So where social welfare are at the moment, in particularly in terms of the working family payment, where those payments have to be made, this bill should help as well to reduce that. So it's better for society, it's better for individuals, it's better for families, and it's a very, very simple bill that will fix a problem that we have, a growing problem. Armando.
Deputy Conway Walsh, Minister O'Gorman.
Very much, Ceann Comhairle. Deputies, apologies, I wasn't in the chamber when you commenced, and I would like to thank both deputies for bringing forward this private member's bill. The government won't be opposing it at second stage, and as the deputies have said, discrimination at any stage in employment is unacceptable, and the proposed amendment here today to the Employment Equality Act would prohibit advertising a position without including an approximate remuneration. And I appreciate the work that's gone into this bill, and I commend the deputies for highlighting an important issue on pay and transparency, and indeed on equality. And pay transparency is an important part of employment equality, and it ensures that regardless of who is applying for a job, they are adequately remunerated in the event that they're successful in attaining that position. By including approximate remuneration in job advertisements, employers would be taking another step towards creating a more equal working society in Ireland by incorporating equality measures throughout every step of the employment process. There are many benefits to pay transparency for both employers and employees. For employers, pay transparency actually helps to attract and retain top talent and can be a competitive advantage on the job advertisement market. Further, transparent communication about remuneration builds trust from the outset between the employer and the prospective employee. For employees, on the other hand, pay transparency helps to close gaps and ensure that as a society we are making progress towards achieving full pay equity. As deputies will be aware, the issue of pay transparency is also being considered as part of the proposed EU directive. In March 2021, the EU Commission published proposals for binding pay transparency measures. And pay transparency measures are intended to complement and support Directive 2006/54 EU EC, or the Gender Recast Directive, to help address the gender pay and pensions gap across the European Union. In terms of where the draft EU directive on pay transparency is right now, my understanding is that the European Parliament adopted its negotiating position on the proposal in April 2022 with a view to informal trilogue negotiations with the Council. The Council position was agreed in trilogue negotiations in December of last year, and the Czech presidency wrote to the European Parliament at the time seeking their agreement, and the political agreement was reached by the European Parliament and the Council, and it's now subject to their formal co-legislator process. So once agreed, the directive will enter into force 20 days after publication in the official journal, and the Member States will then need to transpose the new elements of the directive into national law within 3 years. I kind of got into the weeds there a little bit, but I think it is important just to realise that there is a big piece of European law coming down the tracks, and Ireland will have to implement that. And that's why I was open to not opposing this bill today, because I think we can look at this bill. We can look at the bill that senators brought forward in the Oireachtas actually on Tuesday. So we had a discussion on a very similar bill in Shannon Éireann on Tuesday, and we can look at both in the context of when we're bringing forward the implementation, the transposition of the Pay Transparency Directive into EU law, into domestic law. The directive looks at a number of issues, so it looks at pay transparency for job seekers, and that's an issue I know you're addressing in your particular proposal today. It discusses broader rights of information for employees. It deals with the issue of the gender pay gap, an issue we've actually legislated on already, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. And it looks at the issue of joint pay assessments as well. So it's quite a wide piece of legislation. We will be requiring to introduce legislation here in Ireland to transpose certain elements of it, and I think when we're working on that, I think probably some of the ideas coming from your own legislation and indeed coming from the legislation discussed in the Seanad will be valuable as part of this process. I think it is important to note in Ireland we have taken important steps in terms of equality within the workplace, and particularly the one I suppose I'm most familiar with, having brought it through the Houses, is the Gender Pay Gap Information Act of 2021. We've just gone through our first reporting cycle, and employers of over 250 employees would have reported on their gender pay gap earlier this year. In my own department, as it happens, we have a gender pay gap in favour of women. We're the only department where the gender pay gap is positive towards women, and it just recognises the very significant number of women in terms of high-level positions within my own department. But it is a really useful tool in terms of forcing companies in a way to reflect on their pay policies, but also make them bring forward proposals in terms of how they address the gender pay gap, because it's not just about the information, it's also about that requirement that they have to set out what they're going to do to address it. And as you know, it was originally for companies of over 250, that will come down to companies of over employers of over 250 employees, come down to 150 employees, and eventually down to employers of over 50 employees. And that goes much lower actually than what's contained in the Pay Transparency Directive, which I think stays at over 100 employees, so it'll have a deeper coverage. It does have a deeper coverage here. So I suppose just to take a step back in terms of why we're undertaking all this work, advancing socioeconomic equality for women and girls is a high-level priority of the National Strategy for Women and Girls. It contributes to advancing women's full participation in employment and public life. And furthering equality measures through the advertising of remuneration would mean that from the outset of job advertisements, workers would be in a stronger position to negotiate, to demand fair pay, because they would have access to adequate information. And ensuring that all rates of pay are transparent would strengthen our ability to prevent discrimination, and it empowers those who currently have little recourse in challenging discrimination that may actually occur. So I think we can all agree that it's unacceptable to discriminate against people in terms of equal pay for equal work. The Employment Equality Acts of 1998 to 2021 provides in domestic legislation for equal pay for equal work or work of equal value for men and women, and the department remains committed to ensuring that our equality legislation is kept up to date. That's why, as Minister, I commissioned a review of the existing equality legislation. We had a successful public consultation on that last year. My department will be publishing the report on that public consultation, summarising the key issues that were raised in that in the next number of weeks, and that report then will feed into drawing up heads of bill for amendment to the Employment Equality Acts, and I would hope that we'd hopefully by, I suppose, the autumn term, we might be in a position to bring those amendments into the Houses. So I think that again is another key element in terms of the ongoing work. We have really good employment equality legislation in this country, but it is originating from 1998, and I think it's a good time now to look at it as a whole and bring what changes we need to bring forward. And I know we discussed in this chamber only a number of weeks ago the issue of particularly adding a new ground of discrimination based on socioeconomic status, and that's certainly something I feel very, very strongly about. So again, thank you to the deputies for bringing forward this bill today. I think, as I've said, I'm looking forward to looking at it in more detail, but the work that government will do in response to this bill will also be understood in terms of our wider response to the EU Gender Pay Directive, and I said the same thing to the government senators in the Shannon on Tuesday. But I think it's an important contribution to this debate, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss it here today. Thank you, Councillor Corlett.
I'd like to thank Deputies Daly and Conway Welsh for bringing this bill, and when it's enacted, it brings transparency to the whole area of pay and job advertisements. It's something that has always been a clear omission in job advertising, that if you're looking at a particular position that people are interested in, that you feel it might suit you, and that there was never a reference to the actual pay or the rate of pay, and that immediately put people on the back foot. They were unsure what was going on or what they could apply for, whether it suited or not. Now, there's an immediate dynamic then between the employer and a job applicant, in which the employer, they held all the cards. They could decide, when you're sitting across from them in a table, what rate of pay they would actually give you at any given time. And the applicant always remained uncertain about the benefits of the job they were applying for, or which they were likely to even provide personal and at times very revealing information at interview stage. And it was their ability to actually negotiate and demand fair play. It was diminished at that stage, and in turn it could put people off from applying for any particular position. It also led to applicants to anticipating the rate of pay themselves, and especially if you were coming into a city compared to the country, trying to figure out, would it pay to come up, rent a place here in the city, or do you travel up and down? Like phrases like competitive salary, that meant little or nothing in the grand scheme of things to people. And there's a pointless phrase actually that gives an impression of a positive rate being on offer without any commitment whatsoever to it. But that habit of advertising jobs without the explicit rate of pay being displayed, or with it being substituted by leading or potentially misleading phrases, it opened the door to a range of trouble and possibilities in the rate of equality, to gender equality and that, because hiding the rate of pay, that enables discrimination, and it can enable an unscrupulous employer, and we all know them, there's no doubt about that, to decide that a particular rate of pay will apply to any particular type of a person, because people may have been part of a minority and will be unable, and most of the times was afraid to speak up when pay came up. And it can perpetuate the gender pay gap that's sadly still evident in certain areas. Now, ultimately, this bill seeks to address these issues by requiring that jobs be advertised with details of the expected pay salary be included in them advertisements. Now, this empowers the employees and potential employees, and it seeks to get rid of the advertisements that are deliberately open to the interpretation and guaranteed nothing at all. So this bill is for the workers and is aimed at strengthening their position in job application process. And I welcome the bill, but I also welcome, Minister, the government not going to oppose it, and we look forward to going further at this stage.
Nash. I think this is a very positive piece of information, and I think that the deputies in Sinn Féin will be the first to admit that it's a very modest piece of legislation as well, and that's in no way any criticism. It's modest because it's realistic. It's a short amendment to the legislation, and it reads, amidst the approximate remuneration for a contract of employment. Very, very simple indeed, very, very straightforward. I do understand, Minister, that there is another piece of legislation, is that right, before the Shannon this week, that seeks to do something very, very similar. And we know that there is a huge conversation internationally at the moment about transparency generally, transparency in public life, transparency in business, transparency in terms of climate action, transparency in terms of commercial interests, sustainability commitments, and so on and so forth. And there should be the same kind of emphasis and transparency around questions of employment and the quality of employment. The Minister, you mentioned earlier on in your contribution the important directives that are being considered by the European Commission and the European institutions at present, and there's also another very important piece of legislation that's coming down the tracks from a European perspective, and that's the European Minimum Wage Directive, which will not just assist us in setting more adequate minimum wages, indeed a living wage, in Ireland and across the European Union, but also it will force states across the European Union to do better in terms of the question of decent work. And in doing that, what they will be required to do is to ensure that more workers are covered by collective agreements, by sectoral agreements, collective bargaining more generally, and it will move to generate greater levels of trade union density, which can only be a good thing in terms of fairer remuneration and more decent working conditions for people across the European Union, and in Ireland especially, given the context that we have in Ireland in respect of the constitutional position of trade unions and questions around that. And while, as we know, people have a right to join a trade union, there is unfortunately an equal right in the Constitution. It is viewed that where an employer does not necessarily have to recognise the trade union of choice of the employee. And that's a question that, to a point, will be resolved by the European directive. And I speak about the European directive because, obviously, it does link back to what we're discussing here today. And I think Europe will, in some ways, and the direction of travel is very clear, and Europe will, if we don't do it already, if we don't do it in advance, in some ways force us to change our Employment Equality Acts to reflect the kind of amendment that is being proposed by Deputies Daly and Deputy Daly and Deputy Conway Walsh. Who can fear transparency? Bad employers, quite frankly. And we've made this argument consistently. It's only bad employers who would fear this. Good employers, I think, would embrace this idea, this very progressive idea. And it's been said by previous speakers, the difficulties that workers, especially in some sectors, have in terms of applying for a job, having a reasonable salary expectation, only for that to be thwarted once they might be offered the job. And the legislation proposed here today, the amendment is quite simple, and it refers to the approximate remuneration. So this gets around any objections that employers may have in relation to your commercial sensitivity or competitiveness within an economic sector. Approximate remuneration, I think, is reasonable. It's reasonable to expect that somebody who is seeking a job or being interviewed for a job, that they would have some clear understanding of what the salary involved would be. I think everybody would accept that's reasonable. And I thank you, Minister, for the positive way in which you have approached this bill. And I am struck by something that Deputy Conway Walsh said earlier on, and I think Deputy Daly as well, in relation to the experience of migrant workers. And there is a migrant worker pay gap. There's no doubt about that. We know that anecdotally, but there is evidence there as well to suggest that that is the case. And arguably, potentially, that kind of issue would be a matter of concern to the WRC, and as well could come up against issues in relation to the Employment Equality Acts themselves. But I don't believe there's a huge amount of case law in that area, and it's always the case as well, of course, that vulnerable workers who are liable to exploitation are less likely than others to take cases for examination to the WRC or to other institutions. So this is actually about protecting the interests as well of the most vulnerable of workers across our society. I think it's a good bill. It's something that the Labour Party is pleased to support. Minister, I do want to recognise your own work and acknowledge your own work in terms of gender pay gap information legislation, an initiative that was spearheaded by my own colleague in the Shannon at the time, Ivana Bacik, who pioneered the concept of this legislation in Ireland, and would have worked closely with you, Minister, and with your officials to finesse that legislation. And ultimately, we do have that legislation in place now, but we do have a significant gender pay gap in this country, something that does need to be addressed. And I know, Minister, that's something you're committed to. And we look forward to working with everybody in this House to move this particular issue on. I want to congratulate again Deputies Daly and Conway Walsh for this initiative. It's a very welcome one.
Anish Antara has 5 minutes. If you forego the 5 minutes, do you want?
I think so. I think I've addressed the key elements and set out the government's position.
All right, and that's agreed.
That's agreed.
Yes,
very.
You have 10 minutes.
Yeah, very briefly. I'll only take 1 minute, I'd say, and that is I thank the Minister that it's unopposed. We're open to working with him and with any of the other senators even who are working on this issue. In my own experience at work, I didn't do very many employment law cases, but anyone who did come in with a problem in the workplace were non-unionised, and they had been messed around because there wasn't any backup for them in the workplace. And I think it's important to have small pieces of legislation pushing along in one direction to help them, because I suppose the system tends to work against them. And I remember in Kerry County Council we asked that any contracts that Kerry County Council undertake would deal only with unionised workplace or workplaces who say that they are someone is welcome to have a union in the workplace. And the reply, I remember, that we received back came from a firm of solicitors engaged by Kerry County Council. And when I looked up at the website, it said the main page on the front of their website was how to hire and fire an employer's guide. So that's what an ordinary worker is up against, and hopefully we can all work together on this small issue to try and push things along. And as Deputy Nash said, if we can work together, so that people aren't put out in their time and their expense, like the person I mentioned at the start, Mike, who travelled up from Kerry at his own time and expense to a job that could not take place with a young family. Thank you.